Chris Avell is a pastor in Bryan, Ohio, who's being prosecuted by the city. His crime? Opening his church to the homeless to get them out of the cold. How can this be? Pastor Chris and his lawyer, Jeremy Dice, with the First Liberty Institute, are here to explain. Thank you guys for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Pastor Chris, I'm going to go first to you. I think most people would hear this story and scratch their heads. There must be more to it. So can you just walk us through what's going on here?
Sure. In November of 2023, we made the decision to open our church doors 24/7. It's actually something the Lord had given us vision to do from the beginning, and then wait until the time was right. And the way things just aligned, we knew the time was right. We prayed about it and opened our doors 24/7. Upon doing that, we would have people who'd come and stay for a little while, and some who'd come and stay for a long while. And that was in March when we opened. But then in November, we received a warning from the city that we were in zoning violation, because they were considering, since we had people who would come and we wouldn't ask them to leave without a biblical reason, that we were in violation of the city ordinance that said you could have no first floor residences. So it was considered a first floor residential use. And we were told we were in zoning violation at 10 days to fix the problem. So I asked the officials who brought the notice kind of what we could do to resolve this issue, how we could work together on it. And I was told, we'll get the people out. So we talked and prayed and said, well, that's not something we can do. And so we kind of went on our business. And then in November, we received, I believe there were 18 criminal charges for zoning violation. And that's kind of what kicked off where we are today. So that's kind of the real quick story of how we got to where we started.
18. That's a pretty incredible number. Jeremy, I want to bring you in here. It's funny. I remember a very famous church I won't name took a lot of flack in the media for not opening itself up during a natural disaster in Houston not long ago. And now you're trying to do the right thing and facing legal problems. Jeremy, are there other cases like this? I've never heard of anything like this. I think many Americans have never heard of anything like this. What's going on legally here? And can Pastor Chris actually go to jail for this?
Well, it's pretty unique, and the answer to the last question is yes. As a matter of fact, he's already been sentenced by a criminal court for violating the fire code there. That carries with it not only a financial penalty, but also right now a suspended 60-day term in jail. But if he were to continue to do this and we don't receive the continued relief that we're asking from the court, his current activity would put him in jail. So that's a rather scary prospect for any pastor, and certainly those that are trying to care for those who most need a place of safety like they have at Dad's Place. But is this something similar? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like this going on around the country, and I can explain what's different and what makes this case unique. But just as an example, we've got a case right now on the border of Arizona where Pastor Castro and Gethsemane Baptist Church is trying to hand out food on the border. People in town, people from across the border, people crossing the border, it doesn't matter. They just want to provide them with food, and the city has instituted criminal charges against him and tried to shut down his ministry from a civil perspective. We're still litigating that case right now in Arizona as well. And then there are, we just resolved a case in Florida where a similar ministry, a church running sort of a food pantry outside of their church, through their church, and the city cracked down on that. And it seems that city officials don't like it when there are people that they don't necessarily agree with in terms of their economic background or sort of those that have been pushed to the edges of society, congregate in places like churches. And so what makes Pastor Chris's situation very unique is just how unfair, inequitable they are towards the church in comparison to similar issues. And so what's happening with Pastor Chris first started out as a zoning concern, and we can discuss that issue, and we've filed a federal lawsuit to resolve that thing under a religious land use perspective. But then they quickly shifted over when it became obvious that the public sentiment was not with them when it came to zoning. They then said that this is now a fire code issue, and people just sort of inherently react to something with a fire code issue. And so that seems to have gotten traction in the mind's eye of the public. And that's now what we're fighting over in not just one, not two, but three different courts that we're having to defend Pastor Chris in. So yes, this is unique to Pastor Chris in some respects, but it is not unique in the respect that government officials, when given a little bit of power, will very often grow to meet that power in whatever way they can. And especially if you try to push back on that, they will try to exercise that even further. And if you need any recent example for that, this case is very much like what we experienced during the COVID era, when the cities and counties around the country would say, trust us, we're the experts and we get to tell you what to do, especially when it comes to gathering for places of worship.
Yeah, I mean, and some people don't have groups or lawyers like you to come help them, and we'll never hear their stories. And so, in that sense, Pastor Chris is fortunate. I think what's at issue here to me is prosecutorial discretion, because we could talk all day, and some of the viewers right now might say, well, technically he broke the law, and the law is the law. And, you could say that, and we can argue whether he actually broke the law or not, and I'm sure Jeremy will do that. But there's also something called prosecutorial discretion. If you see a couple of Girl Scouts and they walk outside the line and are technically jaywalking when they're crossing the street, any officer with common sense knows you don't throw them against a police car and give them a ticket for jaywalking. Well, jaywalking is technically against the law. I mean, there's all kinds of laws that are not always enforced when there's big protests, or even the BLM riots in 2020. I mean, there was leeway given. Many laws were broken, but law enforcement said, well, this is a special case. We want to give people the right to free speech. I mean, even up to the presidential level, when Biden had these classified documents, and Mike Pence as well, they decided not to prosecute because we have a history of working with presidents after they leave office, although Trump wasn't given that same generosity. And so, to those who say, oh, the law is the law, but there's leeway in these things, and deciding a little common sense, and maybe, helping the homeless and fire code violations. We might just use a little judgment here. But Pastor Chris, I want to ask you, how do you feel personally? I mean, Jeremy's saying that you could face jail time. I know there's a lot in the Bible about persecution, but I think many American Christians don't expect it to come to their front door. I mean, how are you personally processing this? And what do you think of when you think of the future?
Well, I think the most personal thing is I've been given a responsibility by God, I believe, to care for the sheep. And so my concern is less jail time as far as being in jail. I don't know what that'd be like, but the concern there is what happens to the flock while I'm in jail. And I have competent, loving, qualified other leaders here in the church. But, this is scary for them. This is really so we're talking about people who their entire lives have been told, let's say, that they have no value. They didn't grow up in homes like hopefully you grew up in, but definitely like I grew up in, with two parents who loved them and, and modeled what it was like to live a life honoring God. Now, I was an atheist, so, okay, I wasn't a believer at the time, but my parents loved me and cared for me. I had a community that loved me and cared for me. And that's not the story with the people we primarily deal with. They've been, as Jeremy said, pushed to the edges. They're truly widows and orphans. That means no one to care for their needs. And the Bible has called us so clearly to care for these people, saying that's true religion. That's the purest form of our faith, is to take care of those who are in need. It is an expression of God's love, right? An actual gift we can give to God to give someone shelter in Jesus' name, clothing in Jesus' name, visit them in prison, all these things that Jesus says so clearly. And so, while jail time looms, the actual concern is, being shut down. So with all of this comes a probationary period. And one of the qualifiers given by the judge was, to come in compliance with the fire code. And again, throughout this process, I think one thing I've learned is it's a confusing code. And I think, all of us, meaning me and the city officials and the lawyers, there's not been super clarity about how that really plays out. I think we've gotten down to the point of a sprinkler system may or may not solve the problem. And so again, there's just been some confusion there, but the looming possibility that they could come in a time and on violation of probation and cause these people to have no home. And when I say home, I don't mean in the sense of homeless in a home. I mean, this is their church. This is where they come to worship, come to fellowship, come to share the Lord's Supper together. This is, so in a very real sense, their home in that regard. And I think there's a concern for them that it's in jeopardy. And it's very difficult for them who have been lost and wandering for so long and to finally have found true life in Christ and meaning and hope, to face the possibility of that going away.
Well, so, Jeremy, I'll hand it over to you for the final word. What's next? I mean, you say Pastor Chris could end up in jail for violating some, technical zoning, violate regulations, possibly. If he did or not, we don't, we'll see. But could this go all the way to the Supreme Court? What is the outlook? Give us the legal outlook or the last word here.
Yeah, we're on appeal right now. So we're asking an appellate court in Ohio to review the decisions of the local court, including the criminal court, on the application of the fire code, in particular to Pastor Chris's activity. And the city has basically said throughout this whole thing, look, we just want you to come into compliance with the fire code. And that's what they used to justify, I think, 10 or 12 fire inspections, some of which took place as early as 5 a.m. in the church in a span of about 4 months. It wasn't until 4 or 5, almost 6 months after this whole kerfuffle began that the city suddenly declared that the church needed to install a fire suppression system. That's part of what you're hearing from Pastor Chris, saying we'd comply if we knew what we had to comply with. And if the city would tell us what we had to comply with and we had any satisfaction that the city would be satisfied with our compliance, then we would do it. A fire suppression system, for instance, is not a cheap or easy endeavor. That's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to install inside of a building. And they gave them just 7 days to come into compliance with the fire suppression system. But we know that's not actually the issue that the city is after. Why? Well, number one, the city's got broad discretion. The fire chief has testified to this many times. He does not have to insist upon a fire suppression system. There are lesser ways to accomplish their interest here, and they just simply are not allowing the church to do so. We know that in part because at least we think that the city has made the compelling reason that they're acting against this church based upon people sleeping in a building overnight. Okay, then you would expect to find that policy enforced equally throughout the entire region of Bryan, Ohio. Well, what do we find? We find that it's motels. There are 3 of them in Bryan. None of them have a fire suppression system, and yet they allow people to sleep there overnight. Apartment complexes feature people sleeping on the first floor like they do at Dad's place. Overnight, no fire suppression system. And then you have senior living facilities inside of Bryan, Ohio, again, where people, this time with some mobility concerns, that are allowed to stay there overnight, sleep overnight, and they do not have a fire suppression system. And in response to the queries about that, the fire chief simply says, well, we've made an economic determination that it would be a hardship on those motels, apartment complexes, and senior living facilities, and so we grandfather them into the system. Well, that's just not only an inequitable application of the fire code, it is, in fact, an unconstitutional method of going about their business, and certainly at the base level and common sense says it's unfair. And it's precisely why the Attorney General of Ohio, Dave Yost, who's come to the aid of Pastor Chris and Dad's place with several amicus briefs he's now filed in this case, he said that this is a city using, quote, the petty tools of government in a way that is oppressive to the free exercise of religion by this church. You mentioned earlier prosecutorial discretion in the laws. Those are all true, and we certainly respect the laws of these United States and the state of Ohio. But they also have to answer to the Constitution. And if they cannot be in harmony with the guarantees of the free exercise of religion held by that First Amendment in the Constitution, then it is the laws and the ordinances of Bryan, Ohio that have to yield to the fundamental freedoms we possess as Americans within the First Amendment. That's what this case is all about and what we hope to vindicate for Pastor Chris in the near future.
Well, Pastor Chris, it sounds like somebody tried to bully you a little bit and got much more of a fight than they bargained for. And now there's some national attention on it. We'll see how this lands. Thanks so much for coming on, Pastor Chris. Jeremy, we hope to have you back.
Thank you.
Thank you.